Okay, so welcome to the first of several migration videos I'm going to be making for you. This one will be on medieval migration, which goes from the years 800 to 1500. Really important to remember those dates because if they are in the question, that means you can only talk about migrants from that period. So you can only talk about the Vikings, Normans, medieval Jews, Lombards, Flemish, and Hansa, who will be featuring in this video today. So the context you need to know for the medieval period is that the population before any of the migrant groups we look at arrive is mainly Anglo-Saxons, and they had split up the country into 7 separate kingdoms, as you can see on the map. This is relevant because it makes England easier to attack. So when the Vikings attack, for example, it's partly because it's quite easy to attack England at this time. Most people in England in 800 are farmers because England has fertile land that is very good for farming. Anglo-Saxons had been pagan, which means they don't follow any of the main religions. They're not Christian or Muslim or anything we would recognize as a religion. They often worshipped multiple gods. But more and more Anglo-Saxons were becoming Christian at this time, and the system of government was a monarchy, which means that kings ruled over these 7 kingdoms, and wealth and power and land was held by a very small group of nobles. So that's the situation before our migrant groups arrive. That's useful to know because it's partly to do with some of why of our migrant groups come here. And it's also useful if you're talking about the impact of migrants to be able to say what they've changed about the country. So the first migrant group we're going to look at is the Vikings, and we're going to look at the causes of migration. When you do your migration exam, the questions will either be on causes, why a group came to the country, their experience, how they're treated, or their impact, what they change about the country. So I've split this video up into those 3 different areas. When the Vikings come, it's in the year 865. They've been attacking England before that, but 865 is when they invade with the intention of taking over and staying in the country. In 865, the great heathen army, the Viking army, successfully attack and take over 6 of the 7 Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. They lose the Battle of Edington and they make a peace treaty called the Treaty of Wedmore with the last kingdom that has survived, which is Wessex. A big part of England that they have managed to control and that they start to live in is called the Danelaw, and the Vikings who settle in England are known as the Danes. Within the Danelaw, the Vikings had their own laws and the Vikings were in power, but they are still living side by side with Anglo-Saxons. Why did the Vikings bother to invade the country in the year 865? Partly because England had fertile land that was good for farming, which the Vikings don't have in their cold home countries like Norway and Denmark, where the land was really running out. England had good resources for trade, such as iron, copper, silver, wool, and good trade links which a Viking could use and profit from, especially because the Vikings already have a sailing culture, they're already international traders, so they know they'll have places to sell these things. A final reason is that the Viking religion encouraged fighting wars. Particularly the god Odin was believed to reward Vikings in the afterlife if they had fought in battles and conquered their enemies. So they want to go to England and attack so that they can please the god Odin. When it comes to the experience of the Vikings, it's really quite mixed. On the one hand, they really spend most of the time living peacefully and successfully side by side with the Anglo-Saxons, but there are examples of conflict between the Vikings and the people already living in England. The examples of conflict to remember are the Battle of Brunanburh, where Anglo-Saxons fought with the Viking invaders to try and get rid of them. The St. Brice's Day Massacre, where the Anglo-Saxon king Ethelred did not trust the Vikings that were living in England, and he ordered a mass killing of Vikings on St. Brice's Day. And there's also fighting between Anglo-Saxons and Vikings over the city of York, which is our case study and which we will look at in detail in a minute. The Viking leader Eric Bloodaxe, who had been in control of York, was forced out, and he was the last Viking leader to rule there. However, as I say, most of the time there is peace with the Anglo-Saxons. In the Danelaw, even though it's a Viking area, Anglo-Saxons are living there. Many Vikings convert to Christianity, which shows they are assimilating, which means joining in with and becoming part of the local culture. There were Viking kings of England, showing the political power the Vikings had. For example, King Canute. He had a very successful reign. Canute, as you can see from the cross he's holding, was a Christian, which helped him to get along with the Anglo-Saxons. He also made lots of money for England, and there was peace during his reign. So a successful king showing a successful experience for the Vikings. Finally, our case study of York shows much evidence of the Vikings living side by side with Anglo-Saxons and having quite a lot of economic success, running lots of different businesses and working lots of different jobs. When it comes to the impact of any migrant group, I always suggest you think about it as political. How much are they affecting the power structure of society? Economic, how much are they affecting money and work? And social, how much are they affecting people's day-to-day lives, which can include cultural and religious changes. And the Vikings have a really significant impact. Politically, the Vikings have these meetings called things, that is their official title, things, where they would debate laws and decide punishment for crimes. We can then trace this to affecting British parliamentary democracy and trial by jury, systems of government and law that we still use today. When it comes to the economic impact of the Vikings sailing culture meant they already have lots of international trade routes, and we see lots of evidence of international trade. For example, in York, there's evidence of trade with Russia, the Middle East, and Germany. And all of these things helped to make England a richer and wealthier country. When it comes to the social impact, the Vikings brought Old Norse religion and mixed it with Anglo-Saxon Christian culture, and we can see the impact of this in the days of the week, which get their names from Viking gods such as Thor, Thursday, Odin, Woden, Wednesday, and Freya, Friday. During the reign of Viking King Canute, as a Christian, he visited the Pope in Rome. He enforced Christianity in England, which meant that England had a stronger Christian identity for the medieval and early modern period. And the Viking language of Old Norse can also be seen impacting our culture today, because words such as sister, smile, cake, window, and egg, names ending in son, like for example Thompson or Davidson, and place names like that end in Thorpe and Ness, for example Scunthorpe, all come from Old Norse, showing the impact of the Vikings on our country. As mentioned, the case study for the medieval period, there is one or two case studies for every time period, is the city of York. And I've boiled down the Vikings' impact on York into 4 different areas. The population is increased by Viking migration. Before, there is about 1,000 people in York. After the Vikings migrate, it is 10 times that. The economy in York is boosted by the Vikings. As mentioned, there is evidence of Viking migrants working in a variety of jobs and trade, whether that's leather working, as potters, as blacksmiths, as jewelers, and as farmers, as well as many other jobs and businesses. There are also increased international connections in York because of the Vikings. So we have evidence of furs that have been traded from Russia, silk from the Middle East, as can be shown in this silk hat that was discovered by archaeologists in York, wine from Germany, and spices from Arabia. However, it's not entirely positive. There is some conflict and fighting in the city of York over whether the Vikings or the Anglo-Saxons should control it, especially as York gets successful and rich. The Anglo-Saxons decide they want to take it back. So Anglo-Saxons like King Athelstan fight with the Vikings to take control of it. Okay, our second migrant group is the Normans. The Normans come to this country, as we all know from year 7, in 1066. They come from Normandy, which is in France, and their leader is William of Normandy, who will become King William of England, or William the Conqueror. By the time the Normans came, the kingdoms of England, those 7 Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, had united into one country led by a king called Edward the Confessor, who you can see here portrayed on the Bayeux tapestry. In 1066, Edward the Confessor dies, and a new king is chosen, and that king is Harold Godwinson. This leads to the Norman invasion because William believed he should be the new king, so he invades England to take that throne that he thinks has been stolen from him. The reason he thinks the throne is his is because he said Edward the Confessor had promised the throne to him when he was alive, so he feels that throne has been stolen by Harold Godwinson and therefore he should invade to take it back. On top of this, in 1066, the Norman army is strong and well equipped with horses, so it's a good time for them to attack. It's also a good time for them to attack because William had got the blessing of the Pope, the head of the Catholic Church, so he felt God would be on his side and he would succeed. When it comes to the experience of the Normans, it's quite similar to the Vikings in that there is some conflict with the people already living there, the Anglo-Saxons, but they have quite a lot of political power and economic success. So the fact that the Anglo-Saxons don't really like the Norman migrants is clearly shown by the fact that the English rebel against King William and try to get rid of him. There is a rebellion in the north, but William then crushes this rebellion, and it's followed by the harrying of the north, where William kills thousands of people, burns down homes and farms, and he destroys all the crops so people there starve. There's also a rebellion in the east of England led by Harold the Wake, but again that rebellion is crushed and the rebels are killed by William. Then the Normans become a ruling elite, which means they have all of the power and wealth in the country. The Normans introduced the feudal system, which is a hierarchy where the king, King William, is at the top. Norman nobles are up there with him. In the feudal system, William owned all of the land and he could give it to his nobility, who could give it to their knights, all in return for loyalty to the king. William kept 30% of the land actually for himself. He hands out the rest to his nobility, so the Normans become incredibly rich. They own 95% of the land that used to be owned by Anglo-Saxons. The Domesday Book was made by William, and it recorded all of the land and property owned by people in England, literally down to the last pig. And that allowed William to tax people, take their money essentially, as much as possible, again making the Normans very rich. William also introduced laws to protect the Normans from attacks from the English. For example, the Murdrum Law, which said if a Norman was killed and nobody was found guilty of the crime, the entire community would be fined a large amount of money. So that was to discourage people from attacking the Normans. When it comes to the impact of the Normans, again, I've broken it down to 3 areas: political, economic, and social. And just like the Vikings, the impact of the Normans is really significant. Politically, they as we've said, have a huge impact because they basically take over the country and become really powerful. But we particularly see this by the building of over 500 castles, such as the Tower of London, which protect the Normans and make it easier for them to control England. The Normans keep the English system of government the same, so they keep the shire courts and they keep the sheriffs to control crime and keep law and order, but they give these important positions to Normans rather than Anglo-Saxon to make sure that Normans have all the power in society. Economically, we've already mentioned how they take land in the feudal system and how they take wealth through taxes using the Domesday Book. So this again helps them to become rich and helps their status as the most powerful in the country. When it comes to their social impact, which includes how they change religion and change people's culture and day-to-day lives, they have a massive impact on religion because they build churches and cathedrals such as Durham Cathedral, which you can see in the picture, which, similar to the Vikings, really encouraged England's Christian identity and made England even more of a Christian country. By replacing the archbishops in the church with Normans, this also gives the Normans more power and influence. And by changing the language that is spoken by the people in charge, we see Old French, the language the Normans spoke, changing the way we speak English. So words like pork and beef and names like Robert, Richard and William come from the Old French language. Anglo-Saxon names like Godric, for example, are not very common today, which just shows how Norman culture became much more popular. The third migrant group is Jewish migrants. I've put medieval Jews because Jews appear in all four of the time periods: medieval, early modern, 18th and 19th century, and modern. So if you're stuck on who to talk about in the question, you can't really go wrong by talking about Jewish migration, but just make sure you're talking about the ones from the right time period. So the Jews come in 1070 and they mainly come from Normandy at first. Not a coincidence because it is King William, Duke of Normandy, new King William the Conqueror, who has invited the Jews. The reason is because he needs money to build all these cathedrals, to build all these castles, to put down all these rebellions is very expensive. But he cannot borrow money from Christians because Christians are not allowed to practice usury, lending money with interest, because it says in the Bible they cannot do that. Jewish people are allowed to practice usury, so William invited them to essentially lend him the money he needed to be king. Now, the experience of the medieval Jews really changes over time. At the beginning, they are really accepted in England in the 1000s and early 1100s. They live in Jewries or Jewish communities, and in these Jewish communities there are synagogues, Jewish religious buildings, which tell us they can practice their religion freely. Some Jews at this time become very wealthy from lending money, such as Aaron of Lincoln, who was one of the richest men in England during his lifetime. That's a really great name to remember for an easy example for your essays of economic success for medieval Jews. Not all Jews are involved in business and finance. They work a variety of jobs, from cheesemakers to fishmongers to doctors and many, many more. Being able to do a variety of lots of different jobs generally shows us migrants are accepted into society. However, from the late 1100s, around 1180 and onwards, we start to see a massive increase in anti-Semitism, hatred towards Jewish people. This is partly due to the Crusades, which are a religious war that's going on in the Middle East between Christians and Muslims, even though it wasn't a war with Jewish people. By having religious conflict, anyone who wasn't a Christian was increasingly attacked. The other reason is because the church has been spreading the blood libel rumour, claiming, completely untrue, that Jews killed children as part of religious rituals. So these things are increasing anti-Semitism. And we see more and more examples of anti-Semitism over this time. In 1180, at the coronation of King Richard I, instead of being part of the ceremony as was traditional, mobs attacked the Jewish people there, killing 30 of them. In 1190, mobs in the city of York attacked Jewish people and trapped them in Clifford's Tower, which you can see in the picture, and forced them into a mass suicide where 150 Jews died because they'd rather kill themselves than be ripped apart by the mob outside of the tower. Much of that mob was attacking them because they owed them money that they did not want to pay back. We see several examples of the government or the king attacking Jewish migrants. For example, Henry III forced the Jews to wear yellow badges, which you can see in these images from the time, and he takes away their property, their homes and businesses. The Statute of Jewry in the year 1275 banned Jewish people from practicing usury, which was taking away the main work that they had done to become wealthy. And then finally, in 1290, the Edict of Expulsion banned Jews from the country and said you have to leave or you will be executed. And it's not for about 400 years that Jews are allowed back into the country. Despite only being allowed to be in the country for about 200 years, medieval Jews still have a really significant impact. But I would say that impact was mainly economic rather than political or social, although there is overlaps in some ways. Even though not all Jewish people practiced usury and worked as moneylenders, those that did lent that money to monarchs, they lent it to nobility and really important people, meaning it had a big impact on the country and was used for building castles, such as the Tower of London. Jewish money was also used for building religious buildings, like Westminster Abbey. It was used to build universities, such as Merton College, Oxford, and it was used for fighting wars, such as the Crusades. So, by having that economic impact, we also start to see them impacting education and impacting politics and other areas. The final three migrant groups from the medieval period I've grouped together because we learn about them in less detail, and also in many ways they're very similar. So these three groups are all from different parts of West Europe. We have the Flemish weavers, who are from the Low Countries, the area that is now kind of Belgium, the Netherlands. We have the Lombard bankers, who are from Lombardy in Italy. And we have the Hansa merchant, people from the Hanseatic League, who were mainly German. The Flemish weavers come for the cloth trade. The clue is in the name. They are very, very talented at weaving wool to make cloth, but England has the best wool from the best sheep, so if they want to use it, it works for them to come here. They are encouraged by the monarch to come. Edward III promised them their own guild, which is like a business organisation, and he actually stops English wool from being sold to the Low Countries to make sure Flemish weavers have to move here if they want to use it. Another slightly different reason is that the Black Death, a horrible plague disease, has just gone through England, and it's killed 30% of England's population, which means England is really in need of workers. There are loads of jobs available, and as a result, wages are really high. So some Flemish people move because they'll be able to get a good job in England because the need for workers is so big after the Black Death. A final reason is the 100 Years' War. In Europe at this time, there is a war going on affecting lots of countries, and people move to England to escape the fighting from that war. The Lombard bankers also are affected by the Black Death, and they also come to get jobs and wages from England that are happening because the Black Death creates a shortage of workers. They are also trying to avoid the 100 Years' War, which goes into Italy. But specifically, they have been allowed by the Pope, even though they are Christians, to practice usury. So they come to the country to replace the Jewish moneylenders who are being attacked and are kicked out of the country in 1290. The Hansa merchants also come to get the jobs provided by the Black Death. They also are trying to avoid the Hundred Years' War, which has affected Germany. But specifically, they are given trading rights by the king for the Hanseatic League to trade in England. So all three of them have economic reasons: cloth trade, banking, and international trade, but they also are trying to avoid the Hundred Years' War, and they also are trying to take job opportunities created by the Black Death. When it comes to the experience, it's always pretty useful to just divide experience into positive or negative. Much like other groups we've seen, like the Vikings, it's a mixture of positive and negative. On the positive side, it's obvious these groups have economic success. The Flemish weavers had their own guilds and made huge profit from the wool trade. The Lombard bankers had certain families like the Bardi family and the Ricciardi family who get very wealthy from banking. And the Hanseatic League were able to set up the steel yard, which you can see in the picture, a massive trading base on the River Thames that they are able to trade from. On the negative side, we do see anti-immigrant attacks towards all three groups. Flemish weavers are attacked during the Peasants' Revolt of 1381, and many Flemish people are killed by these violent mobs. Lombards are attacked during the evil May Day riot of 1517, where a speaker called Dr. Bell gave the speech saying that Italians were stealing jobs and stealing your women, and he creates a mob that goes and attacks Italian homes and businesses. And the steel yard, the base of the Hansa merchants, was attacked by mobs twice in the medieval period. In terms of their impact, it's mainly economic, like with the Jews, but again, it's very, very significant. The Flemish weavers are such successful cloth traders that cloth becomes England's main trade, main source of wealth, and they actually help develop England's economy from a primary economy where people make their money from farming to a secondary economy where people make their money from making things and selling them. So they literally help England develop as a country. The Lombard bankers have such an influence on the banking system that words to do with banking that we see today, like credit, credit card, debit, debit card, bank, bank account, come from them. And with the Hansa merchants, much like the Vikings, their trade in the Hanseatic League boosts England's international trade and helps England make more money. So we see again a very significant economic impact. So those are the migrant groups you need to talk about for any questions on the medieval period, but I want to draw out some themes that might be useful to think about, especially for a 16-mark how far do you agree question. You might get how far do you agree work was the main cause of migration. So I've picked out 4 different key themes to think about: invasion, avoiding conflict, economic opportunities, or basically coming for work or to make money, and invitation and encouragement when the government, in this case the king, has encouraged migrants to move to the country. When it comes to invasion, there's 2 obvious examples: the Vikings, who invade in 865 with the Great Heathen Army, and the Normans, who invade in 1066. When it comes to avoiding conflict, it's the last 3 groups that I talked about. The Flemish, Hansa, and Lombards are all trying to avoid the 100 Years' War in Europe. When it comes to being invited to the country, the Jews are invited by William the Conqueror to practice usury, and the Flemish weavers are encouraged to come to the country by the king, who wants them to use their wool weaving skills. Obviously, the key reason is economic opportunity, because all 6 groups partially come because there are opportunities to make money in England. The Jews and the Lombards are coming to get involved in money lending and banking. The Vikings are coming for farming and trade. The Normans are coming to add England to their empire, and they make huge amount of money from taxes and taking land. The Flemish come to participate in the wool trade, and the Hanse merchants come to participate in international trading. When it comes to the experience, as I said, you mainly need to think about positive or negative, and you get a real mixture in the medieval period. No one is truly all positive or all negative, but some have more positive or more negative experiences. The Normans, for example, have a more positive experience. By becoming a ruling elite, they literally get huge wealth and money from ruling England. The Flemish, Hanse, and Lombards, and also the Vikings, all definitely have positive experiences, especially in being very economically successful. The Flemish, the Lombards, the Hanse, and the Vikings all make a lot of money from migrating to England, whether that is through trade or banking or the wool trade. But they also experience attacks, whether that's attacks in the Peasants' Revolt, attacks in the evil May Day riots, or attacks on their steel yard, or attacks like the Battle of Brunanburh and the St. Brice's Day massacre. When it comes to negative experiences, the obvious example is Jewish migrants. Yes, some of them are massively economically successful at first, but the level of anti-Semitism and hatred they experience to the point where they are kicked out of the country in 1290, I would say puts them in the negative category. As already said, impact, always think about political, economic, social. Political impact is mainly Vikings and Normans, both of whom successfully invade and either take over the whole country or most of the country. In case of the Vikings, they changed the political system by using things that encourage democracy and trial by jury. The Normans obviously introduced the feudal system and completely changed the power structure. When it comes to social impact, again, it's the Normans and the Vikings that have the most, whether it's through changing our language with names and words like Robert, William, pork, egg, smile, sister, Davidson, or changing religious practices or having religious influence, as shown with Thor's Day, Freya Friday, or the building of huge numbers of churches. Again, though, economic impact is kind of the clear winner here, as all migrant groups have an economic impact, whether that's through increasing taxes in the Doomsday Book like the Normans, increasing international trade like the Vikings and the Hanse merchants do, whether that's being involved in lending money and banking like the Jews and the Lombards, or whether it's transforming England's wool trade like the Flemish weavers. So a really useful activity to do now, having watched this video, is to do some practice questions to actually put your knowledge to use. Remember, for a 4-mark question, you need to identify a similarity and give 2 examples, or identify a difference and give 2 examples. So for this first question, you need a similarity, and then an example for the Jews, and an example for the Flemish that back that up. For the explain why questions, you need 3 paragraphs on 3 different reasons why. So for example, 3 reasons why migration to Britain is increasing at this time. For the how far do you agree question, you need paragraphs for and against, and you need a clear judgment saying if you agree or disagree with the statement in your intro and also in your conclusion. So for example, the main cause of migration in the medieval period was invasion. You might disagree because you think the main reason is economic benefits, and then you might have a paragraph on invasion, a paragraph on economic benefit, and then a paragraph on another factor like avoiding conflict, or maybe even 2 paragraphs on economic benefit to really prove your final judgment that economics was the main reason for migration in the medieval period.